It's a large chopper from Joe Calton. Picked this up a while ago. One of the main things I was interested in was the performance of the handle, which is an epoxy cord wrapped based grip. Kind of interesting to see comfort, indexing, security in hand, a few other aspects of the grip. Picked this up also because I wanted to support Joe as a knife maker, because while many knife makers and manufacturers you can have conversations with if you're praising them or agreeing with them, it's a bit too rare to find someone that you can actually ask questions of, even ask evidence for some of their claims, and disagree with, and still have a civil and productive conversation. You wouldn't think that'd be too difficult to do, but it is. Full specifications on this knife are in the description, but basically it's a big piece of spring steel, differentially hardened, so it's edge quenched, hard edge, soft spine, soft tang. This is not a blade for light finesse work. It can still be used for it because you can choke right up on the handle and neutralize the balance, but you still got a lot of raw weight in your hand. So even though it looks like a decent sort of cleaver shaped knife, it's not really that suitable for finer work in the kitchen, though you do see knives like this in India and other rural places, in fishmongers, stuff like that. In terms of precision sort of cutting work, interestingly enough, for heavy force cutting, or you're putting all the force you can into the cuts, it's very similar in raw performance as an ability to rough out material as a standard Mora. It's a little bit behind. If that may seem a bit odd, you got to remember, even while the edge angle is a bit higher on this than a Mora, it tapers behind the edge immediately, so it's thinner. And once you get behind the edge, which compensates, and you end up with a blade that, when you're doing heavy sort of cutting, can almost match the performance of a Mora. For lighter sort of cutting, it will be behind a Mora, because lighter cutting is more about the edge angle, and a Mora is around 10 degrees per side, and this is significantly higher. It's not really made for a lighter brush work. It's a bit too heavy for its length, and it's a bit too more forward balanced. You want a sort of more neutrally balanced blade for brushwork, which is a bit longer and that works better on more basically faster and snap type rotation cuts. I did find, however, interestingly enough, that the precision was much higher on this than I expected. Initially, when you get a blade, although this may sound a bit silly, it takes a bit of a while for your eye and your coordination to line up where the blade is in relationship to your hand. So making the cuts exactly where you want them generally takes a little bit of time. But for this blade, I found that the precision and accuracy was higher initially than I expected. And after a little bit of thought and consideration, I figured out that what's probably going on is that on most blades you have sort of a belly here. So when you're doing lighter brushwork and you're working through the tip to maximize your speed, you're sort of looking at, or your target is a sort of smeared out area. With this blade, because I was working almost sort of laser precision focused on the point, the precision was kind of higher, which was interesting, which may sort of make the argument that for lighter brushwork, a tip like this may actually be of benefit. It's also nicer for moving wood around, because you can see on a chop you're presenting the very tip very easily to the wood, so it's very easy to stick this in wood and move it around. It's not, however, the greatest point for digging and for prying, where you want to point more in line with the center of the blade. There's always that sort of give and take generally when you're looking at knives. The handle was initially relatively abrasive, which you would expect being natural cordage. However, it smooths out in use rather quickly. I've chopped about 1,000 pieces of wood with it, and it became significantly smoother. About 1,000 2x4 pieces of wood by the end of it, and it sort of stabilizes at about this level. But initially, when I was first using it and figuring out not only where to hold it on the handle, but where to chop with it on the blade and the kind of grips to use, the hand, it is moving around a little bit. You don't get exact ideal chops. There's a bit of twisting and a bit of sort of more vibration and just movement of the knife, because again you're still trying to figure things out, and in that respect the handle does get a bit abrasive right there on the webbing point between your thumb and index finger, especially with my left hand, which I was doing a fair bit of work with to get some experience and get my precision and accuracy up. Because my coordination was down, that also means basically that the movement of the knife tends to be higher, and the feedback you get tends to be higher because you're not making as controlled a cut. So my left hand actually got a bit abraded relatively quickly, and I actually wear a glove for some of the chopping. And again, that went away. It's no longer an issue. I got the coordination to use this with my left hand, and it's after getting slightly a bit smoother in the handle anyway. An interesting thing that I did find, which mightn't be fully obvious, this is basically a unidirectional wrap, so the wrap only goes one way and it's very consistent. That means the security back and forth is very high. However, the security rotationally is actually relatively low, meaning that when you're using it and when you're cutting with it, it resists moving backwards or forwards very heavily, but it doesn't resist rotation very much at all. Now you have a nice indexing feature because it's much wider than it is thick anyway, but initially, especially with my left hand, because the edge is relatively thick and my coordination was relatively low with my left hand, and the fact that it's not very much textured in this way, I did find that glancing and rolling was a bit of an issue with my left hand initially. Again, as precision went up and experience went up, that sort of went away. The other thing that I found was that this is a rather shallow edge quench, and the reason that I determined that was, again, mainly with my left hand because the precision and accuracy wasn't there, and especially if I chopped into an area that had a heavy knot, I could bind the blade and could stick it. And the normal way that I get that out is I just lean into the blade, crack the wood, and draw the blade out. Well, I could actually put a permanent bend in this blade by leveraging it sideways, again, when it was stuck either in a knot or around a knot, which tells me that a large part of this blade isn't actually hardened, and it's only hardened down by the edge, which leaves the blade as a whole with a lower strength than you might expect given the stock thickness. Now again, like everything else, that's a trade-off and sort of give and take. The large amount of sort of soft steel in and around the spine and through the tang means that the shock or the damping absorption is very, very high on this blade. There's no real sweet spot in terms of vibration that you would normally get on a blade. It's very easy and comfortable to work with any section of this blade, and again, that's because annealed steel or very soft steel in general absorbs shock and vibration relatively well. But one of the things you want to be careful of when you're ordering or getting edge quench blades done is to specify the hardness of the edge quench. And again, the balance that you want to achieve is that the higher you bring up the edge quench, the stronger the blade will be. The lower that you leave it and the softer that you have the spine, the more it will basically increase that damping ability, and it greatly increases the toughness and overall ability of the blade to handle shock. Now, in terms of raw chopping performance, it's relatively high. Again, this is a heavy blade, lots of mass, and a big handle that you can either use up close for more precision type work, or you can really lean back on it to get a lot of power into the cut. And this is even big enough for me to use two-handed, but I want a bit more experience before I did that. One thing that I will say though is because the edge thickness again is a bit higher than some of the other blades, that basically means you have to bring a lot of power into the cut. It's not a blade that's well suited for very light whippy type chops, but again it has a lot of mass, decent amount of length, a big handle, so you can really put power into this cut. So the design is sort of cohesive. All the elements work together. So where it works really well is on relatively decent sized pieces of sort of softer, clear wood. The relatively heavy edge bites into the wood and sort of splits it apart, so it's not very sticky or binding in the wood. Where it doesn't work very well is sort of on small, harder diameter woods, because you want a thinner edge to get into that wood and cut it instead of pushing the wood out of the way or causing it to bend and spring. And you'll even see on some of the chopping where the wood is extended past the sawhorse, and as the wood gets very small, I have to take it back and put it on the chopping block and then actually cut through it. Because the smaller diameter wood extended past the sawhorse is too flexible, and when I go to chop it, the wood either bounces or actually snaps off. And that's kind of dangerous. You don't want the wood moving around a lot because the glances can be very frequent in that sort of condition. Now, in terms of edge holding, the performance of the steel is exactly what I would want or what I would expect to see from a decently hardened and tempered piece of spring steel, which basically means that it ignores wood. After about 1,000 pieces of 2x4 sized wood, no real effect on the edge. There was no chipping, there was no rolling, and it still easily cuts grasses. And all you have, of course, is very slight wear. And of course, because it's a spring steel, it's easily sharpened with any kind of stone. You don't need expensive abrasives. So, very decent blade. It's going to be very well suited for softer deadfall, especially the stuff that's partially rotted, because again, it won't bind into the wood. It's very easy with the tip to move wood around, and a relatively heavy edge profile would allow me to work on that wood without extensive sticking. It's not going to be that good for the smaller, springier type wood because you want a faster cut with a thinner edge, and that's where a blade like Mike Gavik's knife shetty comes into play. So it's interesting how complementary this is to Mike's design. There's sort of a dual sort of system where one of them is very good, the other one is not, and they sort of swap. So that's going to be kind of interesting. The only thing that I would say in regards to things that I wouldn't do with this, as is related to the fact that because it has an edge quench and because a lot of the blade is relatively soft, I wouldn't do it very much splitting with it. Because if the wood was rather tight grained, especially if it had any kind of heavy knots, it's very likely that this blade could warp rather than split the wood. Now, if that does happen, it's very easy to straighten the blade out. When I did actually twist the blade to try to break those knots open, to clear the wood, and the blade did take a permanent set, I just bent it the other way, straightened it back out. It's no big deal. And that's one of the benefits of edge quench blades, or blades in general that have softer spines. They're near indestructible in terms of actually taking them to ultimate failure, and when they do get damaged, it's very easy to restore. But again, you can modify that by requesting the height of the edge quench, and the higher you go with it, the stronger the blade will get. So that's just something to keep in mind. So initial opinions on this are very favorable, and I look forward to using it more in the future. This is the case that it came with. Very nice piece of leather work, clean stitching, drainage hole at the bottom, very wide fold over belt loop, and I just put a piece of cordage through the belt loop because generally when I get up and actually working, I often take these cases off and I just hang this from a branch. But very nice piece of leather. The only thing that I will say is that it looks like the glue or whatever was used to hold this together sort of has dried and it's starting to come apart, so I'll probably re-glue this later on.